what I felt, having gone then into companies and seen the value of having this learning contract alongside a learning group and the two structures working together, was I'd entered the Polytechnic in the management centre, so I went back to the management centre and set up the personal development division, which was totally new, but managed to persuade the dean that it would be a good thing to do. So we set up a division where it was based around self-managed learning, and what we offered to companies was the notion that they could just do some self-managed learning, or they could sign up for a postgrad diploma. So we launched a postgraduate diploma in self-managed learning, and got lots of people who came on it from all sorts of companies. Ford locally, I mean obviously GEC, we've got contacts with public sector, so the local council, even from education, you know, people who are working in education. So all sorts of people came on the postgrad diploma program, and then we started to go into companies and run programs for them, and that has developed since about 1980 to now. And we've worked with thousands of managers in, you know, more than 100 businesses. So, for instance, just to cut a long story short, we've worked with most government departments. We worked with the Cabinet Office, and they even did a whole kind of brochure, stroke, I don't know what you'd call it, prospectus, where it was around self-managed learning. So it was like saying to departments in government, self-managed learning seems like a good idea, you know, why don't you do it? And here's how it works. We work with Department of Work and Pensions, developing their people, DEFRA, Welsh Assembly Government, Department of Health, and all these cases are usually middle senior managers. When we work with cable and wireless, for instance, we not only work with senior managers, but we also, you know, what we try to say is this approach is just a process which you can use with any level. The danger often we found it going into a company is that they would see us working at that level and therefore assume that the process is only appropriate for that level. But in cable and wireless, we managed to persuade them that it wasn't just for senior managers. We worked with technicians who were out on the boats laying cables. We had a group of secretaries, personal assistants to the board, who formed a group of 6. And that was great because they found it really liberating, because somebody was prepared to take their idea of learning seriously. and they came up with all sorts of interesting things which their bosses wouldn't have thought about. Like a number of them said languages, you know, that we're actually an international company. Why can't I learn French or German or Spanish? And of course there was no reason why, you know, so we encouraged that. I mean, so it was, so what we're doing is helping people to set goals that they'd not thought of and where the bosses hadn't thought of, but giving them an opportunity to think through, well, this is the reality of my work, and also to think that they could have a career where they might go beyond being a secretary into something else. So again, some of them did start to take an interest in learning more about business and management, because they thought, well, I actually know a lot about this. And again, doing that question 2, finding out about themselves, they started to realise that they knew quite a lot about a business, because if you're a personal assistant to a director, you learn a lot kind of serendipitously. So that was an interesting example. We did graduate programs. At BA we ran a program where they wanted to recruit some different graduates than their normal ones, and it was part of their cultural change program. I was working with the human resource department there anyway, and so we ran a self-managed learning program for people who were straight out of university, and that was quite challenging, because they initially started with the assumption that they'd been hired into BA into important jobs. The idea was they were on a fast track to senior management, so therefore they knew everything, you know. So it was that kind of arrogance, and then they had to realise that, you know, maybe they didn't know everything, and there were quite a lot of things they needed to work on. So government departments, we worked with one of the first health the trust, the St Helier, and it was a programme for all their managers across the whole of the trust, and it was a so-much learning programme. In the book that we did around programmes, Sainsbury's were looking to move out of their old Victorian ways to, they had a personnel department and they were moving into the modern world of human resources. and they were going to change the role of personnel people and of their district managers, who were in those days in Sainsbury's, a district manager was like a district inspector. They would go into stores to inspect them, and so it was always the dreaded visit of the district manager, because that was, the role was not developmental at all, it was inspectorial. So the company was realising it needed to change, and we were involved with some work around that, and so all the personnel people needed to work in a different kind of way, and so we ran a programme for everybody. You know, there was no option. Everybody went on the So Much Learning programme, and I can comment on this one because it is written up in the book by the two personnel directors that they had. That what was valuable for the business was, as well as a lot of people learning to take more charge of their own development and to learn things that are relevant to the business, they also it helped people to make choices about their career, because for the first time they could sit with peers and talk about, what do I want in life? So a number of them decided, for instance, to take sabbatical years and travel the world, because there would be a number of sort of 30-year-old women sort of going, well, I want to have kids, but I want to, why can't I just travel the world for a year and then come back and have a family, and there was nothing to stop them except what was in their heads, so they go, right, we'll negotiate to have a year sabbatical unpaid, and then they'll come back. And what the director said was that a number of people, as a result of the programme, felt that they didn't have really the heart in what the new approach was, so decided to leave. And yet there were a number of people who initially were thinking about leaving because this was a change that they weren't very keen on, because it was quite a radical change in their role. But as a result of talking with peers and thinking through what they wanted in life and their career, decided to stay. And the two directors said, well, what happened was that the people we were worried about leaving and we wanted to stay, stayed, and the other people who we weren't sure about how we would cope made their own decisions to leave. And they could leave in the right kind of way, and help to leave, in a way that they got some development, that they could go on to a job that was more congenial to what they wanted to do, so that it was a much more civilised process. And that has a lot to do with peer group, people being able to be in a group where they could talk about whatever they wanted, so long as it was related to development, and that they could create their own goals, and that nobody was going to stand over them and say, you're not allowed to do that. They could devote their learning to whatever they wanted to do. So the people who wanted to leave were, in a sense, wanting to learn stuff that would help them to leave, and the people who wanted to stay were, well, yeah, I want to have a career in Sainsbury's, and therefore, but I want to be me as well in that context. So it's how do you bring together in those goals me as a person alongside what the business needs, and work that one out in a sophisticated way, as opposed to traditional top-down command and control approaches, which would be the organisation says, well, this is what you've got to learn to be around here, and and then the individual then, well, I'm going to go, or stay, without that kind of dialogue of working through. And the whole thing about a learning group, of course, for organisations was the groups would meet about once every 4 or 5 weeks. So in between times they could be testing things out and thinking through. So they would be thinking, well, maybe I'd like to think of a different kind of job, but in the same organisation, and they could test that out and come back, or they could go and test out a way of learning they hadn't thought before. Because typically for big organisations like Sainsbury's, the assumption was if you wanted to learn something, you go on a course. And always the challenge of, well, do you really need a course? So I ran a sort of mini group of the two directors, so I worked with the two directors. And one of them was saying, well, I may be a director, but I think I'd need to influence things more like the marketing guy or the finance guys, they were the experts in this field, and I don't really, how do I challenge them when I'm not knowledgeable about finance and marketing and things like that? So I need a course, And then I was saying to them, well, what do they do? What happens in your board meetings? What's the process by which things happen? And so I suggested, well, how about you just see what happens, and how do your meetings work? Who is more influential than who? Instead of focusing on the content of the meeting, focus on the process, the way the meeting goes, and then come back and talk about it. And then he came back and said, well, yeah, I could see that people, for instance, could ask questions about things that weren't in their area, and that influences, and so various things that he came, and eventually said, no, I don't need a course. He said, well, I can see that I've now got a sort of focused area of development that I need, but there's no point in going on a week's course on influencing when 95% of it I probably know anyway. It's the 5% that I need, and why waste time and money doing a course. So there's a lot that came out in terms of people recognising that they could learn things that they wanted, they could do it in a very cost-effective way. So eventually we wrote something called the Handbook of Work-Based Learning, because we were basically trying to say to organisations, a lot of the learning is actually there and it's free. Like time and again I've had quite senior managers after a while admitting, well, I'm supposed to know about how the finances work, but I don't really what a P&L is, and I don't really understand some of this jargon from the finance people. So I need to go on a financial managers course, and that can be challenging. I'd say, well, have you talked to your finance people? Well, no, because they're boring accountants. Well, give them a chance, So they go off and they go and talk to one of the finance people, and they come back and say, well, a nice guy, and he explained it all to me, I don't need a course. And you go, no. And hopefully what they've learned is that they can learn that way for other things as well, that you can go ask people in the organisation and it doesn't cost anything. And yet there are companies that even today will run financial managers courses when they've got finance departments of people who are expert on the business's finances, otherwise why are they employed there? And because there is this notion that the course is what matters, and it's still the way. And many years later, a group of 13 of us who've done more about learning in organisations than anybody else. All of us have written books, each of us probably written more than 100 articles and papers, conference presentations, worked in the field for 20 or 30 years, and we all came together to try and see whether we could agree on anything. And one of the things we agreed on was that, continuous learning or lifelong learning it's about learning from the stuff around you, and that you only use a training course as the last resort. And we all agreed that training course was the last resort for learning rather than the first. Always. Whatever it is you want to learn. And I remember us running a workshop around this document, we called it a learning declaration, in Ireland. And one of the team said, we gave them a task of thinking about things they wanted to learn and then how they might learn. And we said, if you mention training or courses or education, you have to take off an item of clothing every time you did it. Because it was like a way of trying to say, look, you just don't, there's no reason to think about training and courses. And of course later on we did research in organisations and found that 80-90% of what makes people effective is nothing to do with education or training. That the most education training contributes to a person who is effective in a senior role, either in a professional role or whatever. The most education training contributes is about 10-20%. And other researchers have done the same. Lancaster, Hull, Sussex, they've been researchers, and also in the States at the Centre for Creative Leadership, they've done the same research. Education training is relatively irrelevant for the majority of things. Some will have a specific role in certain things that you need, but most of the things that make someone effective don't come from sitting in the lecture theatre or in the classroom. Well, first of all, a lot was using, one of the parts of the research was actually analysing people's learning contracts. What did they choose as ways of learning? And there were very full choice of training courses, because obviously we'd talk it through and people would realise they didn't need a course, so they would come up with something else. So that was one. Another one was obviously lots of in-depth interviews where we asked people about, well, one of the things, and I do it now with boards of directors, is to say, what's this company about? Its mission, vision, values. You know, what does it do? And we get them to answer that, and then we say, well, so what's your role in doing that? You presumably contribute to that business objective, and then write that down. And then we say, clearly you're good, must be good at it because you wouldn't be employed in that. So write down what it is you're good at. You know, what you can do, what makes you effective. And they do that, and then I'll try and ask people about what that. And then we'd say, well, how come you can do those things? How is it that you say you're good at, you know, dealing with people, or you can think strategically, or you can analyse a business problem, or you know, good at selling, or whatever it is, you know, and you say, well, how come you could do that? And about 10 to 20% of the answers are training, education, courses, whatever. The most mentioned is experience, but then of course you have to unpack it. Well, what's your experiences which have given you these things? So we used a number of different methodologies. The researchers at Sussex, Michael Arrow and his team, have done a number of studies, and they've more concentrated in professional areas like education and local government, things like that. And you can read their stuff. Arrow, E-R-A-U-T, Michael Arrow. Lancaster, well, there's John Burgoyne and people like this at Lancaster. Hull, I can't remember the name of it. Centre for Creative Leadership, anyone search that, you'll find some of their stuff that they've looked at in the States. And so there's no study that I know that contradicts that. Every study that I've seen that's based on the reality of actually going into organisations and talking with real people comes up with those kind of results. And so it's pretty stark, really.